Immigration advocates have filed a legal challenge against the U.S. administration rule that restricts access to asylum at the border with Mexico. The advocates are represented by the American Civil Liberties Union. They filed a motion before a federal judge in California. This aims to reopen an existing lawsuit over similar restrictions implemented by former President Donald Trump. The motion also aims to update the case to a new target and the new regulation issued by the incumbent President Joe Biden. The new rule is part of Biden's policies to address a possible rise in the number of immigrants to the U.S. This comes as COVID curbs, known as Title 42, ended at midnight on Thursday. Tens of thousands of migrants have already crossed the U.S.-Mexico border. Washington says it wants to curtail illegal immigration. Rights groups, however, say the policies violate human rights. For more on that, we're joined by John Steppling, author and commentator, who's joining us from Norway. Mr. Steppling, the immigration advocates are claiming that the human rights are being violated at the border with Mexico. What are your comments on that?
Something of an extraordinary, I don't know, way of putting it. I mean, it's at the very least that. Look, the U.S. has deployed 24,000 Border Patrol agents, militarized. The U.S. military is sending several thousand troops to the borders. Homeland Security has hired military contractors paid for by Homeland Security. All of these people are militarized. There's drones and Humvees and automatic weapons. It resembles a war zone. Now, in January, Biden went to Mexico City to meet with Obrador of Mexico and Justin Trudeau of Canada in the North American Leaders Summit. And he talked about, congratulated the United States for all their investments in Latin America and how much they're doing for Latin America. What they are doing, just as one example, is Kamala Harris's project, $3.2 billion investment in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. What that is really is a tax break and economic incentive for big clothing manufacturers like Gap and so forth to build more sweatshops. This kind of exploitation is exactly why you have a flood of immigrants moving northward trying to get into the U.S. But if we look at the backdrop of this kind of draconian militarized repression of immigrants, you have in the United States 1 in 6 children going to bed hungry. You have 40% of Americans, or I forget the statistics, 43 million Americans suffer food insecurity. Suicide is on the rise. It's now the second largest cause of death among adolescents and teenagers. Antidepressant use has risen 400% in a decade. And we have the homeless crisis, which the media never reports on it, at just astronomical levels at this point. You have an infrastructure that's falling apart, bridges collapse, parking structures collapse, trains derail, the big toxic spill in Ohio, and on and on and on. Biden has sent $140 billion to Ukraine, which of course is just a way for the defense industry to make money. The U.S. is in crisis. De-dollarization is accelerating globally, and so the default response from the U.S. is always a militarized crackdown on somebody, usually the most vulnerable. They created this problem. Now they are cracking down on and Biden's policies are worse than Trump's. The so-called FIRM Act will dictate that heads of immigrant families have to wear GPS monitoring ankle bracelets and have curfew restrictions, and if they violate any of those curfew restrictions, they are sent back to wherever they came from. Uh, but we've seen
Mr.
this in the
Steppling.
UK and we've seen it across Europe as well. Yeah.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned yourself, the reason why these immigrants are coming not just to the United States, Europe is also facing a similar
Right.
crisis, is because of the wrong policies of these countries in the first place. Their economic prosperity is because of the policies that they carry out in the countries of origin of these migrants seeking asylum. Why isn't anyone discussing that, and why isn't there change in those policies?
Well, I mean, nobody in mainstream media is discussing it. Certainly, other people are discussing it. But you're right. That's the rather obvious, glaring issue here is why are these people making very dangerous journeys with their families marching with their children across deserts and jungles and riding in tiny boats in dangerous waters and so forth. In Europe, Italy, the UK, and certainly now the issue in the United States with the Title 42 expiring, uh, but nobody does because this is what capitalism does. It's an exploitive system, and the U.S. government has never shown any concern for people, any real concern for the poor and the most vulnerable. They just double down on a repressive, militarized response. I mean, you have 30,000 militarized agents on the border employing drones and automatic weapons against the most vulnerable, desperate, and poor people that you can find anywhere. And this is in a country that is undergoing its own economic crisis, a mental health crisis, and whose institutions are suffering a massive crisis of legitimacy. It's just madness. It speaks to the psychopathy of the ruling class in the United States, I think.
Thank you very much, John Steppling, author and commentator, joining us live from Norway.